It was raining the morning of the visitation, and this only served to further darken the heavy, grim sadness hanging on Charlie. His mind was a dull ache of memories and fear as he dug through his closet for his best clothes. A black and white striped shirt, black slacks, plain black tie, and ill-fitting dress shoes. He hadn't seen Elise for 2 days, and even then the visit had been brief as he introduced her to his grandma, and they ate a quiet breakfast in the backyard. His grandmother would continuously relate memories of events concerning his grandfather, as if she were fearful she might forget some detail of their time together. Charlie and Elise would only listen and nod as they sat side by side at the picnic table, awkwardly nibbling at their eggs. When his grandmother took the plates into the house, they sat in the morning sunlight and talked about the coming funeral and possible wedding. To his surprise, Charlie found that Elise had become determined to carry through with her decision and was now diligently making plans. They agreed that they would live with his grandmother for an indeterminate time span. Elise felt that her parents would have to accept her choices, and she had already placed an application at UCD and was looking for work since she had serious reason to doubt her parents would support her financially after the marriage. She would go to classes and work part-time when she could. Charlie would volunteer for whatever extra time he could get at the docks. She had mentioned putting off school for a year, but Charlie had rebuked the idea. Privately, his greatest fear was that he was in the process of destroying Elise's life and future by continuing with this course of action. However, now more than ever, he was unable to accept the idea of losing her. After a few hours of serious discussion, they agreed to part for the day. She would do whatever she could to come to the visitation and funeral. A number of changes were occurring within him with the passing of every hour since his grandfather's death. He now viewed his previous detachment as a ridiculous delusion in which he had indulged himself since childhood. He had used the abandonment of his mother as an excuse to distance himself from those around him with a feigned delusion of superiority. The revelation that he needed people had come like a storm raging through his identity. He did not want to be alone. He did not want to be callous and cold. There was no way to shut off the ongoing rush of emotions and changes that were wrecking his every rational thought. Regret was a beast which was devouring him bite by vicious bite. He was being consumed by a hatred for the person he had pretended to be. He had begun to feel that he, in fact, had the power to alter the world. He would rewrite his own history. He would call his grandfather back, if only for a moment, and promise him that he would do his best to become the man he was raised to be, hard-working, dependable, loving, and strong. During the visitation, he stood at the long line of guests who filed into the funeral home from the raining afternoon outside. Elise had come, as she had promised, in a plain gray dress and her makeup subdued to the point of transparency. She seemed a beautiful, timid young woman with dark, soulful eyes and a soft, pouting mouth. There was a point when he had glanced over at his grandfather's coffin, and only for the briefest moment he thought he detected a shape moving along the wall behind. He had blinked through the blur of tears, and it was gone. As the last of the mourners left, he saw his grandmother speaking with his uncle, who had flown all the way from America for the week. No one could find Charlie's mother, and of all the siblings, she was the only one who did not attend. It was as he walked his grandmother across the street to the car that she took his hand and looked at him with the utmost seriousness. "Charlie, there's something you should know." "What is it, Grandma?" "Uncle Thomas has asked us to come and live with him in the States." Charlie stared at her with mute confusion. "Now, I know you've been making some plans with your girl, and besides, I don't think I could leave Ireland if I wanted to. But you're the man of the house now, and you need to know about these things." Charlie thought about Elise and her parents, and the problem of the IRA threatening her and her family. If he asked, would she go? He thought of what it would mean for them to leave all this behind and begin a life in another country, another world. But you know he could take care of you, Graham, Charlie said as he forced himself to consider the realities of his grandmother's age. And what would I do, Charlie? Sit there in some house in Pennsylvania and wither to dust? Graham, he's got a whole slew of kids you hardly even know. Wouldn't you like to see your grandkids? She looked down for a moment, as if he had struck upon a familiar note. I had thought about that, but it's not Ireland, Charlie. What would I do without my card games and the church functions? After all these years, just to pack up and leave seems crazy. Charlie rubbed his eyes, which were tired and worn from days of crying. I know, Graham, but these things have just gotten so out of control. I think about you being in that house by yourself all day. As he spoke, he saw Elise approaching. She had been talking to Charlie's aunts, who had seemed to take an immediate fancy to his pretty young girlfriend. She had seemed the very personification of loving, sweet sympathy to his family. Just don't close any doors yet, okay, Graham? He said as he patted her frail, liver-spotted hand. She's that judge's daughter, isn't she, Charlie? Yes, she is. It's very dangerous for her to be out in the city, she warned thoughtfully. I know, but it's dangerous for her anywhere right now. What if I told Thomas to take you and her back with him? Her words were careful and weary as she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. I'll not leave you. She eyed him for a moment. I won't close the door just yet. There's a part of me that says I might have a few more years left in me, and it might be good to spend it with a family. With children. Charlie smiled as Elise put her arm around his grandmother's hunched shoulders and gave her a light, comforting hug. Charlie had seen a way, but the path was stony and marred with pitfalls and dangers. Sitting in the car a few blocks from her house after dropping off his grandmother, he asked her what she thought of the possibility of going to America. Her eyes had widened as her face took on an expression of undisguised excitement. Could we really do that? She asked. I think the question is, do we really want to? With a whole new life in a new place. It's terrifying, to say the least, but if you could convince your grandma, then it would be the answer we've been waiting for. Just think about it. Charlie kissed her, and she smiled brightly as she got out of the car. He watched as she began to walk down the street, waving as she went. He looked down at the floorboard and saw her bag. Grabbing it, he opened the door and called to her. She turned and began walking back. And that was when he saw the headlights of a car parked on the corner of the block flash on. He began to approach her, bag in hand, as the car turned onto the street and began speeding towards them. Suddenly he was filled with dread. A dark, horrible feeling had begun gnawing within his chest as he saw the bright beams coming closer at a speed much too fast for the small back road. He called out to her as the car drove by and its windows rolled down. He saw the man in a black ski mask extend his arm from the back window, and in his hand, he was holding a pistol. Charlie screamed and ran forward as the shots were fired. The first bullet caught Elise in the back. She froze stunned as two more penetrated her shoulder and throat. The gunman was now firing blindly into the night, and the one shot caught Charlie in the shoulder as the other grazed his head. He fell to the street as his vision blurred, and excruciating hot pain pounded from the wounds. The lights from the car vanished as he lay in the darkness against the cold, wet pavement with the image of Elise's face, a mask of shock and terror burning in his mind. He was slipping into a bottomless void of blackness when he first heard the voice. It was low, calm, and tranquil, like a breeze blowing dried leaves over the ground in autumn. He sensed a presence nearby, but could not see the form from which the words were originating. "Do you want to die, Charlie?" the voice said in the darkness. Is she dead? He thought in response. "Yes, the girl is dead. Do you wish to join me?" "Yes. If Elise is dead, then I will die too." "What if there's another way?" "Another way? To what?" "What if you can live and still be with her?" "That's not possible." "Oh, but it is. All you have to do is let me in." "Let you into where?" "Into yourself. Let me in and you will live. Then you can retrieve her." "Retrieve her? How?" "I'll show you. You must trust me, Charlie." Through the dimmest veil of his weak hold on consciousness, Charlie could feel a weight pressing down against his shoulder as if someone was leaning over him. "I'll give you time, Charlie. I'll give you time with your sweet girl." "But when I come back, you must forfeit. Do you agree?" Charlie's sluggish, agonizing thoughts could not focus, and he was incapable of rational calculation. All he could think of was Elise, laying, bleeding, a few steps away. "I agree," he thought. That was when he felt a grip tighten around his shoulders as if he were caught in a vice. He had no strength to struggle or resist as the pressure increased, and he felt himself being rolled over onto his back. Something was there, crawling over his chest towards his face. He could not open his eyes to witness whatever thing was gently prying open his mouth. For a moment, he felt suffocated as if something cold and jagged forced its way down his throat. And then he was awake. He felt sharp stabs of pain as he pulled himself to his hands and knees. There was blood pouring down over his eyes, but he could just see well enough to find Elise's body only a few feet away. His body was functioning of its own accord, and he could only watch, as if from a distance outside his own mind, as he pulled himself forward towards the heap of gray and red which was his love. The voice said in his mind. "Do you see it?" He concentrated on the shape of her body in the road and could see a strange, glowing steam rising in a haze from the lifeless body. "Hold it to her," the voice commanded. Charlie could see his hands stretching out, and from around the tips of his finger issued a light blue glow, which seemed to fill his vision. He watched as the smoky haze began to pull back into the body. "Good, Charlie. Now, seal it in," the voice said intensely. As he concentrated, the blue light seemed to radiate out over Elise's crumpled form until she was bathed in luminescence. "Good, Charlie," the voice laughed. "You've done very well. Now, don't forget our deal." Charlie slumped down into the road and listened as he heard sirens. After a few moments, he heard voices and doors slamming as footsteps ran across the concrete. The last thing he heard before he finally relinquished his grip on the waking world was the words, "She's still got a pulse." We gotta get her to the hospital. It was cold and dark. He was standing in the old cemetery looking down at a grave. He tried to read the headstone, but the words would not form into any coherent, readable language. It was night, and a heavy fog hung over the monuments. It didn't matter that he could not read the stone. He knew whose grave this was. She was there, lying beneath the damp earth, rotting away in the coffin. He had to see her, to hold her one last time. He was down on his knees, clawing and scraping at the mud as he desperately tried to reach her. Then there came a noise. At first it was a low, distant humming, but in a few moments it had stopped. Something was approaching from the other side of the tombstone, from the shadows. He fell back and began to scramble away as he saw the shape slowly crawling into the top of the marble grave marker. He wanted to scream, but the terror had frozen him in a cold, icy grip of dread. He knew what it was. He had seen it so many times in this one endless, reoccurring dream. He wanted to look away. He did not want to see it again, to know what it was that was hunting him. He was forced to look and to see the creature as it perched black and ominous on Elisa's tombstone. It was... Charlie leapt up screaming and thrashing in the blankets. Elise immediately grabbed hold of him and held his arms down as his wide, terrified eyes gazed around the darkened bedroom. "Charlie, wake up! You're dreaming again! Wake up!" He looked into her startled dark eyes, and immediately his stare fell to the scar on her neck. She was alive. She had never died. It had only been the same horrible dream he had been having at least twice a week for over 5 years. She was alive and safe with him. They were together in their house in Rhode Island. They had moved here 2 years ago after his grandmother had passed at his Uncle Thomas's in Pennsylvania. She had turned on the bedside lamp and was nervously lighting a cigarette as he sat shaking in a cold sweat on the edge of the bed. "Bloody hell, Charlie. Is this ever going to end?" she asked as she stared at him over the damp, sweat-soaked mattress. "I'm sorry. I've been taking the pills, but they don't stop the nightmares," he answered as he stood and went to the bathroom. He heard her switch on the television as he turned on the faucet and splashed cold water onto his face. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw the tired, haggard man he had become looking back. He held back his thick blonde hair and studied his own scar, which ran up the side of his forehead and into his hairline. The memory of the shooting briefly replayed itself in his mind. He wondered if it would ever fade. Like the scar, it was always present. "Holy shit!" he heard her exclaim. He dried his face with a towel and walked back into the bedroom to find her sitting bolt upright in the bed with the TV remote clasped in her hand. "What is it?" he asked as he lay down beside her and softly kissed her shoulder. He looked at the other scar still visible and at her back and shuddered. He could see her lying in the hospital bed, attached to IVs and machines. The doctors had said it was a miracle that she had survived. "Eric Drescher," she said in awe. "What has he done now?" he chuckled. "He's dead," she answered, as she gazed at him with disbelief. He looked at the television and saw that there was a late-breaking news report. Eric Drescher had been found dead of an apparent drug overdose in his hotel room. Charlie felt a sudden cold fall over him as he watched pictures of the dead singer flash across the screen. The similarity between he and Drescher had not altered over time. He felt as if he were watching a news report about his own demise. I guess it finally got him," she said sadly. What finally got him?" Charlie stammered. "The lifestyle, all the drugs and the celebrity. I guess it's amazing that he lasted as long as he did." "Kind of like us," she said with a wistful smile as she leaned over and kissed him. Her lips were cold. They always were, and had been since the day she had awakened in the hospital. Neither of them had ever been the same after the shooting. Sometimes he tried to remember what had happened after he had seen the car coming down the road, but his memories grew dark and cloudy after the moment when he first heard the gunshots. All he knew was that Somehow, miraculously, they'd survived, and that his Uncle Thomas had from that point taken charge of the events which followed. He had not only insisted, but had demanded that he and his grandmother come back to the States with him. He had at first been reticent about taking Elise as well, but after Elise's father had confronted him in the hospital waiting room with a storm of belligerent rage and accusations, he had made it a point to disregard the arrogant man's concerns. "You know, sir," he had said, as he rose threateningly to meet the judge's gaze, "if you had not said even half of the things you had just said, I would have been on your side. If you hadn't tried to bully me into submission and lay all the blame on my nephew, I would have agreed wholeheartedly and told Charlie myself that your girl should go with you. But seeing what a raging arse you are has convinced me that if she wants to come with us, then she's welcome. If you got a problem with it, I suggest you get busy with your lawyers." The judge had done just that, but Elise was years beyond the age where he could control her decisions. He'd even filed to have her found mentally incompetent due to the stress of her shooting, but no psychiatrist could confirm the appeal. Despite the pleading of Elise's mother, he had declared her as a non-entity in his mind, and Elise had not spoken to either of her parents since the move. Charlie had attributed this ordeal as the cause of the many changes which had come over her in the following years. She was no longer the charming intellectual girl he had known for those brief, wonderful months in Dublin. She was a broken, quiet shell of indifference and introspection, merely a shadow of the person he had known. She suffered frequent ongoing bouts of depression and rarely, if ever, left their house. It had fallen on him to be the sole financial earner, and despite a few weak attempts at continuing her education, she did little else but read, listen to music, and watch movies. Therapists had diagnosed them both as suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they were prescribed a large number of antidepressants and nerve pills, which only seemed to add to the continual numbness which pervaded their daily lives. There were times when it seemed that they had not survived the shooting at all, but were only continuing on in a lingering dream of life. Elise turned off the television, and they both lay down again and attempted to fall back to sleep. There was no thought of lovemaking between them. They had not had a truly intimate relationship for many years. Just as he had on many nights before, Charlie closed his eyes and thought, "I did exactly what I didn't want to do. I ruined everything. I should have let her be." He wondered sometimes if she hated him. "I love you, Charlie," she whispered from the darkness. He knew it was true. After everything that had happened and everything they had become, she still loved him. "I love you too," he whispered back, and even then, he still meant it. The alarm clock sounded only a few brief hours after Charlie finally descended into the restful, dreamless slumber. He fought from the depths of bleak, endless limbo to force himself awake as his heavy eyelids refused to respond. It seemed to Charlie that he had not been rested in years. Between night terrors, frequent insomnia, and the side effects of his various medications, a good night's sleep seemed a distant, lost fantasy, like the longing for a normal life. He rose from the bed and struggled into his clothes as if wrestling an invisible assailant, and made his way to the bathroom. Opening the medicine cabinet, he withdrew a brown plastic bottle of prescription pills and stared at them with loathing. "How good they're doing me," he mumbled, and placed them back on the shelf before closing it to find the stranger behind the mirror glass, once more staring back. "Who are you looking at, you ugly bastard?" he asked of the other, who only gazed back with bloodshot, baggy eyes. "You need to find a beach and get some sun, you shit," the mirror self said back. "I'll do that on the day off," he chuckled. "Oh yeah, I don't have days off." After emptying his bladder, he walked half asleep past the bed where Elise still lay motionless. He paused for a moment and watched to make sure her chest still rose and fell with even breaths. She would sleep well into the day. He had a private fear that someday he would come home and find her still lying in bed, never to awaken. He kissed her on the cheek and made his way to the kitchen where the coffee sat warm and waiting. He filled his large work mug and, grabbing his lunch from the refrigerator, headed for the door. The first 4 hours of his shift passed in a dense fog of exhaustion as he drove the loaded pallets of cereal across the dock on a forklift and into the shipping containers. Twice he popped caffeine pills to avoid the inevitable nods which would overtake him otherwise. In his lunchbox was a small cellophane of Ritalin tablets which he used on particularly rough days to get through the remaining 6 hours after lunch. It occurred to him after the first year that these behaviors would eventually lead to either a full mental or physical breakdown, but he could see no other option unless Elise started working, or else he had just begun to sleep, as he should. At lunch, he sat on a small table by himself in the corner of the break room where he began removing the Tupperware container of leftover Chinese from the night before. Hungrily, he popped the lid off and dug his white plastic fork into the rice and took a bite. He was savoring the chicken fried flavor until he noticed that several grains of rice in the container were moving of their own accord. He stared down in disgust as he realized that there were well over 24 maggots crawling within the rice. He leapt up from the chair, spitting and gagging, as several of the other workers looked up from their sandwiches and bowls with shocked interest. "What the hell's wrong with Mick?" the supervisor said, using the ridiculously bigoted slur that was Charlie's nickname at work. "Fucking maggot, Sal," he answered as he grabbed a napkin from the small metal holder and began spitting and wiping furiously. Sal walked his massive girth across the room and stared down into the spilled container. For one brief instant, Charlie feared that Sal would look up and say that there were no maggots, but only rice, like in the scene from The Lost Boys. "Good God, Mick. Tell me which restaurant you got this shit so I will never go there." Sal laughed nervously as he took the container and dumped it into the trash. "It was fine last night when we had dinner," Charlie replied as he tried to compose himself. "Well, you know how tricky flies are, buddy. You never know where they lay their eggs." "Yeah, I guess you're right." Charlie hastily closed his lunchbox for fear that Sal would see the bag of pills within. "Hey, I need someone to cover for Prescott, so could you stay an extra 2 hours tonight?" Charlie looked down at the floor for a moment as his stomach lurched. "Yeah, no problem, Sal." "Good deal. I knew I could depend on you, Mick. You love that overtime, don't you?" "Can't get enough of it, sir," Charlie answered with a weak smile as he grabbed his pail and left the break room. By himself in the restroom, he gazed at the stranger as he chewed 2 tablets of Ritalin and washed them down with water from the sink. The taste was awful and bitter, but the effect was immediate. Already his mirror self was looking livelier. He even gave himself a wink as he left to go back and clock back in for another 8 hours of driving and loading. "Yeah, that's Mick," he thought to himself. "He just can't get enough of that good OT. That's money in the fucking bank right there. Gotta pay those bills, man. He's got that sweet little piece of ass at home he's gotta take care of. He's gotta pay for those pills and that therapist, 'cause he's too fucking wired and tired to get a hard on, but she doesn't really like sex anyway, so it's all good. So what if he's so out of it that he just ate a mouthful of maggots before he even knew they were there?" Charlie was back on the forklift, driving around with renewed vigor and a strange half-smile, half-grimace as he sped back and forth on the endless racetrack across the docks. This is the life that he saved them for. Endless, stark misery for her, and never-ending mindless work for himself. Good old Mick, he fucking loves his job. Wait a minute, he thought, as he slowed the forklift down and stared dumbly at the steering wheel in his own thin, shaking hands. Why did I just think that I saved us? He began to see a vision of that night. a blue light around his hands as he steadied his fingers clasped around the black circle. He could almost see a glow around them. I'm losing it now. I'm going mental from no sleep and those goddamn pills. His stomach was rolling, and a wave of dizziness fell over him, a solid wave which threatened to push him into unconsciousness. He stopped the machine altogether and undid the clasp of the safety belt as he stumbled onto the hard, smooth concrete floor. He raced through a world of spinning images until he fell against the restroom door. He staggered for the stalls, but caught a glimpse from the corner of his eyes of himself in the mirrors of the 3 sinks which lined the wall. For a second he was sure that he had seen a nightmarish monstrosity in the glass as he rushed by. It had been his body, but only his own head had been replaced with the bulbous, horrible visage of an insect. He blinked and looked back, and it was gone. Falling onto his knees before the toilet in the stall, he began to vomit bile as a wretched cold chill encompassed his entire body. It's food poisoning, he thought, as he heaved again until his ribs ached. I'm hallucinating from food poisoning. What I just saw in the mirror was from that old Vincent Price movie. It was called there was the tombstone in Donnybrook, and sitting on the marble was a giant. Hey, Mick, came Sal's voice from the outside stall. You all right, buddy? Sal, I think I've got food poisoning, he called back, coughing and gasping. I'm so sick. I need to go home. Hey, buddy, if you're that bad off, you need to go to the ER? Sal was walking towards the door. You don't want to mess around with that salmonella and shit like that. No, I just want to go home, but I don't think I can drive. Charlie rolled over and looked at the stall door as it began to open, but it wasn't a human hand which came around the side and pulled. It was a long, black appendage covered with spiky black hairs. It was the limb of some massive, horrible... Charlie screamed, and the world fell into darkness. His lunch had gone bad, and he got really sick, Sal was saying to the paramedic as they carried the unconscious Charlie on a gurney from the restroom. They were rushing towards the open door on the loading dock as other workers looked up from their labor with curious concern. How much did he eat? The young woman with the tight blonde ponytail asked as she studied the ghostly, pale, and feverishly sweating young man. Hell, I don't know, Sal expostulated. From the looks of things, he probably threw up most of it before I came into the restroom. Does he have any medical condition, or is he taking any medications? As far as I know, he's healthy as a horse. Sal paused as he thought of the pills he had seen the Irishman taking over the past few months. I think he might have been taking some speed, though. Sal knew that if his superiors were to find out that he was aware of one of his crew taking drugs and had not reported it, his job would be on the line. But the thought of the kid dying because he was busy covering his own ass was too disturbing for him to accept. Do you think he might have stroked out? It's a possibility, she said as they loaded the stretcher into the back of the ambulance waiting outside. Sal watched as they climbed inside and the sirens began blaring. He winced as he thought of the inevitable investigation that would ensue. Damn, he thought to himself with frustration. He was my best guy. He reluctantly returned to his desk as he rehearsed what he was going to say when he called Charlie's wife to tell her what had happened. He found the number in his Rolodex as he carefully punched in the numbers and waited as the phone rang a total of 9 times before the woman finally answered. She sounded as if she had just gotten out of bed. He carefully cleared his throat as he calmly described the situation. In a few moments, the woman's voice, in a thick British accent, went from tired and groggy to hysterical and terrified. He told her the name of the hospital and told her that he would help in any way he could. But she had already hung up. What a shitty day, he thought to himself, as he began to look over the truck schedules before getting to fill out the new accident report. Elise slammed down the phone and stood trembling as she tried to force some measure of clarity into the fog of her jumbled thoughts. She stumbled to the dresser, where she began to dig through the mass of tangled clothes as she realized that she had not done laundry for days. Charlie's sick. The thought kept repeating over and over like an alarm sounding in her brain. Charlie was almost always ill with something. Colds, flus, any number of infections had plagued him over the past few years on a monthly basis. That his supervisor had said that he had been violently ill and then passed out. He was going to a hospital. The thought that he might actually have something very seriously wrong was driving her into a panic. He's finally done it. He's pushed himself too far. What if he dies? What if he's disabled? She was now on her knees going through the piles of discarded clothing on the floor looking for pants and a shirt. God, please let him be okay. He's all I have. She was crying as she pulled on the jeans she had last worn 2 days ago. She knew she would have to take a cab, but she couldn't remember where she had put the extra cash. Why had she taken those sleeping pills? This was an emergency, and the adrenaline rush should have sharpened her mind, but the drug's heavy sedation was leaving her incapable of thinking clearly. She was scared and alone. Charlie always took care of these things. When his grandmother had went to the hospital a week before her death, it had been Charlie who had snapped into action and taken them to the emergency room. She stood in the kitchen looking around at the counters with bewilderment as she tried to remember where the money was stashed. She began searching the cabinets and kitchen drawers until finally she saw the wad of 20s held in a brown rubber band sitting in the junk drawer. She took it and shoved it into her pocket as she rushed to the door. Standing in the hallway, she realized it had been weeks since she had left the apartment. The corridor seemed stark and frightening as she went to the elevator. As she pushed the button for the first floor, she began to cry again and tripped as the doors opened and she entered. How could she have let herself fall so far into isolation and apathy? She just hoped that she could find a cab. God, please let Charlie be okay. Courtney stared down at the unconscious man as she once more checked his vitals as the ambulance rolled out of the parking lot. His complexion was waxen, and his blonde hair dark with sweat. She saw that his blood pressure was a mere 90/60, and his pulse a faint whisper in his veins. She doubted that this was a case of food poisoning, but she could not reason why his vitals were so low if he was suffering an overdose of stimulants. She wondered if maybe the large man at the warehouse had been mistaken in what drugs this man had taken. She was staring at the oxygen mask over the man's face when she noticed a dark shape moving within the clear plastic. She leaned in closer, and her lips parted with wonder as she saw a small black form of a fly crawling inside the mask. As she watched, she saw more of the insects, apparently, crawling from the man's open mouth as they flew out to the walls of their prison. Carefully, she raised the mask as the winged escapees from his mouth left the plastic cup and began buzzing around the interior of the ambulance. "What's going on back there?" Lonnie, the driver, said over his shoulder as he navigated the busy noonday traffic. I don't know. He's got flies in his mouth," she said with astonishment. "He's got what?" He's got..." Just then, she leapt back against the wall of the van as the man suddenly jerked violently and inhaled deeply as if he had been suffocating and was just now able to breathe. As she took an enormous breath, his chest rose from the stretcher and his mouth widened as if he were preparing to scream. However, in place of a piercing yell, Courtney watched as his thick black cloud of flies exploded from within the man's mouth and filled the ambulance with a swarm of 1,000 insects. Courtney did scream as she lashed out frantically against the dense maelstrom which assailed her. As the cloud reached Lonnie, he was immediately frozen with shock and bewilderment as his vision was abruptly blocked by the fog of bugs. He could no longer see the road as the flies attacked his eyes, nose, and mouth in a furious, invasive assault. He could hear Courtney coughing and gasping in the back as he lost control of the vehicle, and for a brief moment he felt the terrifyingly familiar weightlessness as the road dropped out from beneath the ambulance and it passed the sidewalk and flew deep into a culvert. Time was frozen and meaningless up until the very instant that the van crashed into the ground. They were rolling inside the metal container until finally its descent was halted by a wall of trees. All was dark and silent, but for the incessant buzzing of flies as they scrambled within his ear canals. He tried to move, but sharp stabs of pain were jetting through his torso, limbs, and neck. He struggled mentally to remain conscious as he began to hear a sound behind him. Something was moving in the back of the crashed ambulance. He heard shuffling and clawing as if something was pushing at the walls. He heard a whimpering voice he recognized as Courtney's before a sudden thud ended the weak sound and was then replaced with whipping and cracking. Something was now moving closer from the back of the van towards him, and he prayed he could fall unconscious before he saw what it was. Della sat typing at the computer as the automatic glass doors of the emergency room slid open. She looked up to see a small, dark-haired woman with deathly pale skin and morose, empty eyes walk stiffly and afraid towards the reception desk. May I help you? Della tried not to reveal the anxiety she felt as the woman sat down across from her and gazed up with a haunting and desperate stare. My husband, he was taken from work in an ambulance. I was told they were bringing him here. The girl had a British or Irish accent and would have been beautiful if it were not for the horrible look of anguish and terror which was hiding in the darkness of her eyes. What was her husband's name, and where did they pick him up? Della's voice wavered nervously from the aura of alien sadness which emanated from the girl. His name is Charles McDonough, and he works at the Benson Mills at the Cereal Distribution Center. Della began looking at the report log and froze as she saw the entry. Looking at the woman, she told her to wait a moment as she raised the phone and called the hospital HR office. Yes, I'm calling to verify a report about an ambulance call out at Benson Mills. Yes, okay, thank you. She slowly put down the phone and took a breath as she met the woman's questioning stare. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but there was an accident on the way to the hospital. We haven't got a full report yet, but it seems like the ambulance ran off the road. I'm very sorry, but it seems like there were no survivors. In the 8 years Della had worked the reception desk, she had never before felt as if she were watching a person break, as truly as she was seeing right then. It was as if she could hear the shattering of the woman's very core. Tears were running from her eyes as her chest began to heave and her shoulders violently sob. Soon the silent weeping became uncontrollable screaming as the woman fell to the floor before the desk in a horrible spasm of grief. A nurse appeared around the corner in moments. The medical staff was surrounding the woman as a doctor administered a heavy sedative, which for several long minutes Della feared would not calm the woman's hysteria. She fought and clawed up until the very moment her eyes rolled back and she became silent. Della looked on at the pitiful sight of the aides pushing the limp, frail form of the woman on a stretcher into the ER. She sat back down and tried to steady the frantic shaking of her hands. Never in her life had she felt as if she had just played a part in something which in the hidden recess of her mind reeked of old and wretched tragedy. Diedrich walked into the police station and approached the desk where a middle-aged, balding deputy sat reading a newspaper with a oblivious, dim concentration. He stood before the desk and mustered his patience as the man ignored him completely for far too long to be anything but intentional. Diedrich always tried to be at his most calm and reasonable when dealing with other officers, but the man's disregard for common courtesy was trying him. He reminded himself that to begin using his ability so quickly would be a sure sign that he was abusing his own power, but his emotions were already pushing a suggestion across the desk to the deputy. Before Diedrich even realized it was happening, he had ensnared the man's mind. Yes, sir, the man man said quickly as he dropped the paper and sat bolt upright in his chair. Diedrich gave up, resisting. You have 2 elderly men in custody, and I wish to speak with them, he said coldly. Oh, yes, sir. That'd be my dad and his friend, the man answered mechanically. You arrested your father, Diedrich said with a twinge of disgust. I had to, sir. They were involved in a shooting. Diedrich reminded himself that he would probably have been forced to do the same thing if he had been in the deputy's shoes. Where are they? They're in the back playing checkers. I didn't even close the cell door. The man spoke like a child, reporting to his parents that he had done no wrong. Diedrich smiled as he began to forego his harsher judgment with the realization that the deputy had simply placed the 2 in back with a checkerboard and donuts for the afternoon. May I speak with them? Diedrich's tone had become more relaxed and friendly as the deputy smiled and stood enthusiastically from the chair. That's more like it, Diedrich thought. As Diedrich spotted the 2 gentlemen seated across from each other over a small table, he noted that both looked stern, rugged, and able-bodied for men of any age. One was a large, boned elk of a man with shrewd gaze and long, knobby fingers which were cautiously sliding a red checker across the board. The other, although smaller in build, held a wiry muscularity which had diminished only slightly over the long passing years. Both raised their eyes and studied him with the singular calm analysis of house cats watching a stranger enter their territory. The smaller man spat a black gob of tobacco into a coffee can before he casually jumping his opponent's checkers 3 times. God damn it, Mitch, the elk expounded as he looked momentarily at his comrade. Dad, the deputy said as if hesitant to interrupt the game from some lesson learned much earlier in life. This man is here to talk to you. And who may he be? The large flannel-wearing hunter replied. I don't believe I got your name, the deputy said, flustered by his own incompetence. Jesus, son, the elk bellowed. You just bring some stranger in off the street, and you don't even get his name. The deputy looked embarrassed and shuffled his feet awkwardly. What is your name, sir? The 2 old men looked at each other with wonder at the deputy's politeness. My name is Diedrich Abendroth, and I wanted to talk to you about Miss Karina Drescher. The 2 apparently immediately noted his accent. You related? The smaller man asked, reminding Diedrich of an ancient gray wolf. I am a friend of her mother's, Diedrich said with complete honesty. Well, if you're here to help her, then come on over and pull up a stool, the elk said, gesturing at a wooden 3-legged stool in the corner. Go on down and do some police work or whatever, boy, the elk said, gesturing to the deputy, who looked at all 3 with sullen confusion before turning and walking off, muttering to himself. Diedrich scooted the stool over and sat down with the 2, finding himself more than a little intimidated by their piercing, inquisitive stares. That name of yours is a mouthful, the wolf said as he extended his hand. You can call me D or Dieter if you like, he answered as his hand was taken in the man's worn, calloused grip. D's fine, I can remember that, the elk said as he shook Diedrich's hand after the other. Diedrich was immediately struck by what he could only describe as 2 indomitable walls of sheer willpower and strength which emanated from the 2. As of yet, he had not encountered anyone who seemed as immediately immune to the pressure of his ability as were the 2 elderly hunters. He realized that he would be dealing with the 2 on their own terms. So, what can we do for you, D? Can you tell me what happened in the woods with Miss Drescher? The 2 cast each other a knowing glance as if warning each other silently to be leery of answering any questions concerning the events. I know that you gentlemen witnessed some strange things out there. I have no way to prove to either of you my earnestness in what I am about to say, but I can almost guarantee you that I will believe anything you are willing to relate with complete acceptance. I can only tell you that I have seen a great many unusual things over the past few months, I have been out to Karina's home, and there are in fact a great many photographs which I believe substantiate your story. However, I fear that any authorities will simply discount these pictures as fraudulent. Mister, I never would have shot an unarmed living man in the head, the wolf stated bluntly. I would have blown out his kneecap, or even put a bullet through his shoulder, but I definitely wouldn't have killed him in cold blood. The old man studied Diedrich carefully as he awaited his reaction. Those things weren't living, the elk added coolly. We thought at first they might have been sick, but the more we've discussed it, the more we've come to believe there's some really nasty business going on around here. They had flies pouring out of them like they were roadkill in midsummer. They were cold, blue, and dead, the wolf said, as he began spitting the can with a hollow metallic thud. And the day before we saw something flying after that girl in the woods. Now you can call us crazy, but the best we can figure, that thing flying was the Mothman, and it probably came out of some spaceship and started raising dead bodies to use as experiments or something. We think maybe that Drescher girl was near the landing site and saw some of it go down, but what still don't explain everything she said while we were on our way back into town. They were both staring at Diedrich now as if waiting to see if he was going to stand up and call for the deputy to close the cell door and lock them in. What did she say? Diedrich asked as he reached in his coat and withdrew his pipe. The two old-timers seemed relieved and somewhat comforted by the sight of Diedrich's smoking apparatus. Why people view the pipe as a source of comfort he had not yet surmised, especially since it was somewhat monstrous in appearance. Now, I can't quote her, but she was talking in a really strange kind of voice. Her accent was different, and her mannerisms seemed a lot different than what I remembered from when she took my grandbaby's picture last fall. The elk leaned in through the growing cloud of soft cherry smoke which issued from Diedrich's mouth and nose. As far as I know, Karina Drescher doesn't have any children, but she was talking like she had 2. 3, the wolf outed, holding up his 3 fingers to emphasize the knowledge. Diedrich's eyes widened as he leaned forward to hear every word of the elk's conspiratorial tone. That's right, because she said she had a 3rd that she had forgotten about. She made it sound like she'd been trying to protect the other 2 from something, but since she had forgotten about the 3rd, it got him. Diedrich's mouth hung open with realization as he remembered Petra's story. How could he have overlooked that one subtle detail? Emmerich Drescher had fathered a 3rd child with a student while they lived in England. It had been the original cause of the entire incident of Petra's separation and subsequent suicide. The wolf watched Diedrich's reaction with interest. She was talking like she was some old German man. The words sunk into Diedrich's brain as the revelation began to awaken horror in the depths of his soul. Was it possible that Emmerich Drescher had been acting to protect his offspring from the grasp of his decadent god from beyond the grave? But forgetting his illegitimate 3rd, he had left a pawn for the entity to possess and play. So now, the elk said as he grabbed Diedrich's shoulder with a mixture of intimidation and desperation, can you tell us what the fuck this thing is all about? Because if you got some answers, buddy, you better start talking. Diedrich looked directly into the old man's eyes and said, Tell me, sir, do you believe in psychics? The 3 women made their way into the lobby of the hospital, huddled together nervously as they approached the reception desk. Janelle stepped forward and looked at the receptionist with her best innocent country girl smile. What can I do for you girls today? The woman they knew as Brandy Flowers said distractedly. Hey, Brandy, we were wondering if we could pop in and see how Karina Drescher's doing. Oh, sweetie. I'm sorry, but with all the commotion, I can't let anyone in to see her but direct family, Brandy replied politely. That's just the thing, Brandy. We were sitting down at the diner and we realized that she ain't got anyone to look after her, and we thought she might like to see some familiar faces. Oh, that's awful thoughtful of you girls, but I don't think I can do that. Aw, Janelle pouted. That's just so sad. She's up there all alone with no one to talk to. She knows all of us. Brandy looked at the three girls and felt a twinge of sympathy. Everyone in town knew Karina, and she is one of the most well-liked citizens in Point Pleasant. I'll tell you what, I'll give you her room number and you girls can just slip up there, but if you get caught by any of these folks wandering around in suits, don't tell them I sent you. Brandy gave them a smile and a wink. You're an angel, Brandy, Janelle said as she swept a lock of purple hair from her eyes. Yeah, I know. But just don't be long and don't draw any attention to yourselves. We won't, Janelle said before Brandy told them the room where Karina was resting. They walked down the long hallway from the desk and turned into a seemingly endless incline which ran like a pale green tunnel of fluorescent light. They arrived at the western branch of the hospital, relatively unnoticed until they found room 240. As they entered, Janelle closed the door quietly as they approached the bed where the sleeping woman lay, her hand clasped around a necklace of silver around her long, pale neck. I feel kind of bad waking her up, Marianne said as she sat down on the chair by the bed. Don't feel bad, girls, came a low, sleepy voice from the bed. They all three looked up with bated breaths as Karina slowly opened her eyes and looked at them dazedly. It's nice to see someone besides doctors and nurses. Hi, Karina, Janelle said, sitting down beside the woman and placing her hand gently on her wrist. We snuck in to see how you're doing. As well as I can be, Karina smiled weakly. I had pneumonia and frostbite on my toes. I think the doctors took the tip off of my left pinky toe. Oh, honey, I'm sorry. It's okay. It could have been a lot worse. I wish I could see Russell and Mitch so I could thank them. You'll have to wait on that one, Luann said as she turned on the television, which sat mounted in the corner near the ceiling. By chance, it happened to be tuned in to the local news station, which was reporting on the finding of the bodies of the lost road crew. It's all such a mess, Karina sighed as her hand once more closed over the necklace. Karina, do you want to talk about what happened out there? Marianne said, as non-invasively as possible. It's all so strange. I could only remember fragments. It's like I was drugged or sick or something. I can't tell what was real and what was a hallucination. So you think you were hallucinating? Janelle looked at the other girls as she tried to think of some way to navigate the conversation into details concerning the previous week's events. I had to have been. It's so frightening to think about the things I saw and did. There were entire days when it seemed like I was sleepwalking through life. I would come to, and there would be things all around me that I had done that I couldn't remember doing. What if you weren't hallucinating? Luann blurted without any attempt at subtlety. It's not even possible. I might have to seek psychiatric care or something. I don't think I can go back out there to the house and be alone after what happened. I don't know if you three know anything about my mother, but she had problems like that. I'm worried now that I might be following in her footsteps. Oh, Karina, you wouldn't hurt yourself, would you? Marianne said, her voice trembling. That's just it. Before a few weeks ago, I was really alright. I mean, I wasn't walking on sunshine or anything, but I was fairly content with my life. But I got word that my father had died, and then I got this package in the mail, and after that, everything just seemed to spiral into a tailspin. You got a package? What was it? Luann turned in the chair where she was sitting and looked at Karina with sudden, unabashed interest. I received the package with a key inside, and that was to a box my father had given me before he left when I was a child. I had kept it hidden all these years, and when I opened it, this was inside. Karina carefully lifted the amulet from her chest and held it before them. Janelle reached forward tentatively to examine it, but Karina suddenly pulled it away and covered it in her hands. "Don't touch it!" she hissed defensively. Then, as if realizing her own irrational anger, she smiled. "I'm sorry," she says. Janelle drew back. "It's just that it's all I have from him, really. I can't stand to be parted from it." "There's no need to get all Gollum over it, honey. We don't want it," Luann joked. "Get all what?" Karina said with tired confusion. "You know Gollum from The Lord of the Rings." "I never read those books." They all sat in silence as they realized that Karina was on the verge of tears. "Well, if there's anything you need, you can just call us," Marianne said as she grabbed a stationery from the table and began jotting down numbers with the black chained pen. "Yeah, even if you just want to talk or something," Janelle added as she carefully patted Karina's leg. "I really appreciate you girls coming to see me," Karina said with honest thanks as her eyes dimmed. "I feel so alone. I think I would have even called my brother if he had not just passed away too." "The rock star in England?" Luann asked. "Yes. We were never really close, but he was the only real family I had besides my aunt, and I just don't think I can burden her with all this craziness." "Well, you can burden us." Marianne stood and hugged Karina closely for a moment, and as they touched, she suddenly felt a strange electric chill pass over her and withdrew more quickly than she had intended. "Seriously, Karina," Luann said, standing and slinging her heavy denim purse over her shoulder. "We're really worried about you, and if you need to talk, you can call anytime. You girls are so kind. I'm very fortunate to have friends like you." They smiled and said their goodbyes as Karina's eyes seemed too heavy to stay open much longer. As they left, she had once more slipped into the deep slumber from which she had arisen. In the hallway, they looked at each other with solemn, concerned expressions. "Damn," Luann whispered. "If she's not being possessed by that necklace, then I'm Madonna." "We need to go pick up D at the police station and tell him what we found out," Janelle said as they crossed back up the long corridor. As they turned towards the front entrance, they heard a commotion from the opposing hallway and saw numerous members of the hospital staff pushing stretchers in a long caravan of black bags. Luann gestured for the other girls to stop, and turning, approached the group where she pulled a nurse to the side. "What's all this about?" she asked casually. "We're not supposed to discuss it, but they're bringing in the bodies they found in the woods for autopsy." The nurse rushed off, and Luann returned to the others. "That's really weird," she said as they made their way past the gift shop a few minutes ago. "What?" Marianne said as she pulled her keys from her pocket. "I didn't think that Russell and Mitch took out that